What's going on, friends? While explaining scope, we mentioned that when functions are nested, the inner function can access variables declared in the outer function. Calling the outer function will make everything in the outer function body to be executed. This means that this inner function will be called as a result of the outer function call. Let's run the program to see the output. As you can see, the inner function was able to access a variable declared in the outer function. Now let's do something interesting. Instead of executing the inner function here, what if we return it? Let's say return the inner function. At this point, calling the outer function will return a function. You are able to return and pass a function around because functions are first-class citizens in Python. Now let's set the outer function call to a new variable named inner, since we know that inner will be returned when the outer function is called. If I were to print the type of inner, you will see that it is a function inner. Now let's execute the program to see the output. Great, as you can see, the type of what is returned by this function is a function. One thing we can also do is to make the outer function to take an argument. Let's say x. Then we can get rid of this x. What that means is that we must pass an argument to the outer function when we are calling it. Let's pass the value of 50. Now let's execute the program again. Great, you can see that the type of the returned value is a function. So that means we can decide to call inner, which is a function returned by the outer function. So if we call the function now, that means we are calling this function. And when we call this function, this part of the code will be executed. Let's execute the program again to see the output. Great, as you can see, the inner function was called. Now is a good time to define what a closure is, since you have the needed understandings. A closure is a nested function which allows us to access the outer function's variables even when the outer function is closed. You will agree with me that we should not be able to access a variable used in a function once the function has been called and discarded. But closures, which are the inner function, make that possible. So the outer function variable is 50. After the outer function call, we are still able to access the variable passed to the outer function. If you notice, the value of x is coming from the outer function. So on this line, we are still able to access the value of x after the outer function has been called. Remember that variable x belongs to the outer function. Let's take a look at some real use cases. First, you make use of closure to avoid unnecessary use of class. If it turns out that you have a class having just a few attributes or methods, then it is advisable to use a closure. Suppose in your application, you want to be able to generate users with different permissions. In this case, what you really care about a user is the permission. Let's do a class implementation for that. We are going to define a user class user, then the init method, which is the constructor method. It takes the first parameter as self, then we want permission to be passed. The permission is string type. Now we can say self.name equals read1array self.age equals 10, and finally self.permission to be the permission passed. Now let's define an instance method. Def get user info. We need to pass self as the first parameter since it is an instance method. So we want to return the user information as a dictionary. Let's say name is self.name, age is self.age, and the permission of the user is self.permission. So now let's go and create instances of this class. Read only user, read underscore only underscore user equals an instance of the class, and we need to pass the permission. Let's say read only. Now we can create another user. Let's say write only user equals an instance of the class, and the permission is write only. So on each of the instances, we can call getUserInfo. We want to print this to the terminal. Print read-only-user.getUserInfo. Let's execute the program. As you can see, we have the user information. If you observe this implementation, the only attribute we care about is the permission. We have just a method present, which is this instance method, getUserInfo. In that case, using a class is unnecessary. Let's go ahead to do a closure implementation. Let me comment out the previous code. Now let's make use of closure. We are going to say def user_factory. We want the permission to be passed whenever they are trying to create the user. The permission is of a string type. Then within this user factory, we want to define another function, def user. Let's declare some information about the user_info equals a dictionary. We are going to say the name is Ridwanre and the age is 10, and finally the permission is the permission passed. Then we want this user info returned. Return user info. We can now say return the user. So this user is a closure. First, it is a nested function, that is a function living inside another function. The nested function is also able to access a variable defined in the outer function. And thirdly, the nested function is the returned value. This makes this user function to be a closure. Now let's make use of the closure. We are going to say read-only-user, read-only_user equals user factory. When you are calling a user factory, you want to pass the permission read. When you call this user factory, the user inside is returned. Remember that the user inside is a function. So the function returned by user factory has been set to another variable. Since read-only-user is a function, we can call it. When we call this user, it is going to return user info. Now let's print the returned value on the screen. Print. If I were to run this program, you will see that the output would be the same as the previous output. Now let's execute the program. Great, we have been able to access the relevant information without using a class. Another use case of closures is data hiding. It is obvious that data inside an inner function cannot be accessed or modified except by calling the outer function. And finally, Python decorators use the concept of closure. More will be discussed about decorators in the upcoming lesson. I hope you now have a better understanding of closure and its usage. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. Thanks.